Many times I felt the need to explain myself, not loudly, not defensively, but constantly. I explained my choices before anyone questioned them. I explained my pauses. I explained my change of mind. I explained my silence. I explained my pace. I wanted to be understood. And that desire felt reasonable, even healthy. After all, being misunderstood can feel isolating. It can make you question your intentions, your clarity, your sense of direction. So I learned how to explain. I explained my decisions carefully, choosing words that sounded thoughtful and balanced. I offered context before it was asked for. I softened statements in advance, hoping to avoid discomfort or misinterpretation. From the outside, it probably looked like communication. From the inside, it felt like an effort. I didn't notice it at first. Explaining myself had become automatic. It wasn't something I chose consciously. It was simply how I moved through conversations and relationships. Whenever I sensed uncertainty in someone else, I filled the space. Whenever there was silence, I interpreted it as a cue to clarify. Whenever someone didn't immediately respond, I assumed I needed to add more words, more reasoning, more reassurance. I thought I was being considerate, but over time, the weight of it began to surface. Explaining myself required constant awareness of how I was being perceived. I wasn't just present in conversations. I was monitoring them, watching for signs of confusion, anticipating questions, adjusting my words in real time. I was carrying two roles at once, the one who was living and the one who was narrating. And narration is exhausting when it never stops. I began to notice how often my explanations weren't actually for others. They were for me. A way to reassure myself that my choices made sense, that I wasn't being unreasonable, that I could justify where I was and why I was there. Explanation became a form of self-defense, not because anyone was attacking me, but because I was afraid of being misunderstood. Misunderstanding felt dangerous. It felt like being seen incorrectly, then judged for something that wasn't true. So I tried to stay ahead of it. I explained my intentions before anyone questioned them. I clarified my silence before anyone interpreted it. I justified my boundaries before anyone crossed them. And because it all sounded reasonable, I didn't question the cost. But the cost was there. Every explanation required energy. Every clarification required emotional labor. Every justification required me to revisit decisions I had already made just to make them more acceptable. I wasn't just making choices, I was defending them. I started to notice how often I left conversations feeling drained, even when nothing difficult had been said. There was no conflict, no disagreement, just a lingering sense of having given too much, too many words, too much context, too much access. Explaining myself had quietly become a habit of overexposure. I gave people more information than they needed, more reasoning than they asked for, more insight into my inner process than I actually wanted to share. And the more I explained, the more it seemed to invite explanation. Once you start justifying yourself, it's easy to feel like you have to keep going, to make sure everything is clear, to ensure nothing is misinterpreted. Clarity became a moving target. There was always another detail I could add, another reason I could offer, another way to make my choices sound more understandable. But understanding, I began to realize, doesn't come from information alone. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. And that was the part I struggled with most. No matter how carefully I explained myself, some people still didn't understand. Or they understood, but disagreed. Or they understood only parts, filtering the rest through their own expectations. That realization was uncomfortable. It suggested that explanation wasn't the solution I thought it was. That being understood might not be something I could control, no matter how carefully I spoke. Still, I kept explaining, because the alternative felt risky. What would happen if I didn't clarify? What would happen if I let silence stand on its own? What would happen if someone misunderstood me and I didn't correct it immediately? Those questions made me uneasy. I had learned to equate explanation with safety, with responsibility, with maturity. Not explaining felt careless. It felt like leaving something unfinished. But gradually, something else became clear. Explaining myself wasn't bringing peace. It was keeping me tethered to other people's interpretations. It required me to stay engaged in how my choices landed instead of how they felt to me. I wasn't just living my life, I was managing its reception, and that management required constant adjustment. I adjusted my words. I adjusted my tone. I adjusted my timing. I tried to be clear enough, reasonable enough, understandable enough. But clarity, like understanding, is not something you can force. And the more I tried, the more distant peace seemed to become. I didn't stop explaining myself all at once. But the need to began to loosen, not because I stopped caring, but because I began to see the cost more clearly. I wasn't ready to let go yet, but I was starting to feel the weight of holding on. I didn't stop explaining myself suddenly. There was no decision, no boundary announced, no moment where I told myself I was done. The habit had been with me for too long to disappear that cleanly. What changed first was my awareness of it. I began to notice the impulse before it became action, that familiar tightening. The moment when silence appeared and I felt the urge to fill it, the urge to clarify, to add context, to make sure nothing was misunderstood. I noticed how quickly that urge arrived. Someone would pause before responding, and my thoughts would rush forward to interpret what the pause meant. I assumed confusion, or doubt, or disapproval. And before any of that was confirmed, I was already preparing an explanation. But now, instead of acting on it immediately, I hesitated. Just for a moment. That moment felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible, like I was withholding something important. Silence, I realized, had always made me uneasy. It left too much open, too much unknown. It created space where interpretation could form without my guidance. And I had spent a long time trying to manage interpretation. But in that small pause, I noticed something surprising. Nothing happened. The silence didn't turn hostile. No misunderstanding exploded into conflict. No one demanded clarification. The space simply remained. That was new. I let it happen again. Another conversation, another pause, another moment where I could explain myself and didn't. Each time the discomfort surfaced, but it didn't grow. It rose, lingered, and then softened on its own. I didn't need to resolve it. I started to understand that the urge to explain wasn't always about communication. Often it was about control. Explaining myself had been a way to guide how I was perceived, to reduce uncertainty, to keep things aligned with my intentions. But intention and interpretation don't always meet. No matter how carefully I spoke, people brought their own experiences, expectations, and assumptions to what they heard. My explanations could influence that, but they couldn't determine it. And trying to determine it was exhausting. As I allowed more silence, I noticed how differently conversations began to feel. They slowed down. They became less performative. I was no longer rushing to be clear or agreeable or understood. I was simply present. Presence felt different from explanation. Explanation required me to step outside myself and evaluate how my words were landing. Presence allowed me to stay where I was without constantly adjusting. I didn't disappear. I didn't become distant. I didn't stop communicating. I just stopped narrating my internal process. That distinction mattered. I still answered questions when they were asked. I still clarified when something genuinely needed clarity. But I no longer preemptively defended my choices. I allowed my actions to stand on their own. At first, that felt exposed. Without explanation, my decisions felt more visible, less protected. There was no buffer of reasoning to soften them or make them more acceptable. But over time, something steadier took its place. I began to trust that my choices didn't require constant justification, that if someone needed more understanding, they could ask. And if they didn't ask, it wasn't always my responsibility to fill the gap. That was difficult to accept. I had learned to equate being considerate with being accessible at all times, with offering explanations freely, with making myself easy to understand. But accessibility has limits, and understanding, I realized, is not always mutual. Some people didn't understand me less when I stopped explaining. They understood me differently, sometimes more accurately, sometimes not at all, and I learned that I could live with that. Not because I stopped caring, but because I stopped believing that misunderstanding was a failure on my part. I didn't need to correct every assumption. I didn't need to clarify every silence. I didn't need to narrate every choice. Silence became something I could stand inside without panic. It wasn't empty. It wasn't neglectful. It wasn't avoidance. It was space. And in that space, something else formed. Boundaries, I realized, don't always arrive as firm statements. Sometimes they arrive as restraint, as the decision not to offer more than is necessary, as the choice to let things be incomplete. I noticed how much energy I regained. Conversations no longer felt like performances. I wasn't monitoring reactions as closely. I wasn't adjusting my words in real time to prevent discomfort. I could listen without preparing my response. I could speak without rehearsing my explanation. That simplicity was unfamiliar, but it was grounding. I began to feel more aligned with myself, less fragmented, less divided between who I was and how I was being received. When I spoke, it was because I wanted to speak, not because I felt obligated to clarify. And when I didn't speak, it was intentional, not as a withdrawal, not as punishment, but as permission. Permission to let silence do some of the work. I learned that explanation has its place. It can be generous. It can be helpful. It can deepen understanding when it's invited. But constant explanation erodes presence. It turns living into justification, and I no longer wanted to live that way. Stopping the habit didn't make life simpler overnight, but it made it quieter, more honest, more sustainable. I didn't lose connection. I gained space. And in that space, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing: relief.